Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So today we're going to be looking at Power BI governance. And just as a bit of a heads up, I'm covering a lot of content today. I've got like 6 hours of content into 50 minutes. So I'm going to assume a fair amount of Power BI knowledge, familiarity with all of the concepts around data sets, data flows, and how Power BI works. So I've tagged it as kind of 300 level in terms of the session. It'll be really aimed at kind of Power BI administrators or those who are responsible for looking at how Power BI is to be adopted in the organization. And I see a lot of organizations in this space. I work as group manager at Avanade, working primarily in this Power BI governance space now. I see a lot of clients who've had Power BI for a number of years, often with Office 365 E5 licenses, so everyone has a Power BI Pro license, and now they've got thousands of reports, thousands of workspaces, and no real clarity on how to bring it under control. It's very much like Excel used to be, and probably still is in a lot of these organizations. Just in terms of myself, I run two main communities at the moment. One's called Learn Data Insights, LDI, and I'm actually putting a lot of this content as an e-learning course on that site. I've only done one module, just an introductory one so far, but keen to get some feedback on it. So if you're able to go to the site and have a look, if that format works well, if there's some tweaks, let me know, and we can bring the rest of the course onto that format. So just in terms of what we're going to cover today, we're going to look at Power BI governance overview and in particular look at the Power BI adoption roadmap to see where we are and where we want to be. We're going to look at workspace scope creation, tenant admin and security, managed workspace architecture, and this is what I'm talking about, enterprise BI and premium capacity. That's your kind of managed workspace architecture. Roles, responsibilities of a centre of excellence team, of users, developers, and lastly, monitoring and support. So these are some of the things we're going to try and achieve through this session. So just in terms of next, so we start with the governance overview. So the key mantra of Power BI governance in terms of what we're trying to achieve is discipline at the core, flexibility at the edge. And when you hear about Power BI governance, a lot of it seems like it's command and control. You do everything centralized and just give people what they need in terms of reports. And that's actually not a good recipe for self-service BI. It's much more about user empowerment and user enablement. So you give people trusted data. You give them the right support, the right tools to do their jobs. And that's your discipline at the core. And then the flexibility at the edge is allowing them to build their own reports, allowing them to use the functionality they need to be able to get the insights they need from that data. So you don't try and manage the entire Power BI estate. And actually what we try and do is think about it, Power BI is that kind of mix. So I think BI is a spectrum generally. On one hand, you've got traditional corporate BI. This is where you've had, paginated reports, or reporting services, or crystal reports. It's the kind of reports authored by IT, distributed to 10,000 people every Monday morning. It's very secure and governed, and it can handle those data volumes, but it's not very flexible or agile. If you want to do your own data analysis and change reports, it will take months to get a new report built, and then, by that time, people have changed, processes have changed, and so people go to the other end of the spectrum, which is Excel. Completely flexible, completely agile, but you end up with multiple versions of the truth. You end up with lack of security and governance and control. Power BI is designed to be this halfway house, give you some of that flexibility and agility that you have with Excel, but also some of the security, control, single version of the truth that you have with corporate reporting. But it's a very fine balance to strike. And actually, the default way of using Power BI is to actually use it like Excel. Open up Power BI Desktop, connect to some data, do some data shaping, do some modeling, do some calculations and visualizations, and publish your PBICs. So it's very much like that self-service architecture, but you need to bring some of that control back and bring it a bit more to the middle. So we want to draw this distinction between enterprise BI and team personal BI. So enterprise BI is your trusted artifacts, your data artifacts primarily, which is kind of your data flows, your shared data sets, and the reports and apps that are built off those. And team personal BI is all the stuff that people build off. And it can be using enterprise BI artifacts, obviously, where there's available. but also perhaps other data sources. And what this is getting across is that actually they have different audiences. Typically, enterprise BI is for, again, large distributions. So those apps that are distributed to wide audience, executive audience, maybe stuff that connects to your enterprise data sources, your databases, and also perhaps sensitive data or things like that that need to be part of that, have that slightly more governed control. Team and personal BI is all the rest of it. And actually, most of the BI will be team and personal BI, and that's fine. People will publish it to their own team workspaces. They'll be responsible for it. You're not trying to control everything. There'll be much more of those content creators, and the enterprise BI will really just be built by your real Power BI experts, your kind of black belts in the organization, which we'll come on to. So that's where those two sides of that pyramid kind of come in that distinction. And we'll go into this in quite a lot more detail. So now we're going to look at the Power BI adoption roadmap. And let me try and bring this up. Oh, there you go. Get the pointer eventually. Yeah, there you go. So there's 9 areas in the Power BI adoption roadmap. I'm not going to go through them in much detail now. Obviously, Melissa Coates did a session, I think, yesterday on the Power BI adoption roadmap, and there's lots of material out there on it that she does. So, but just to go through them very high level, and actually there's a maturity level of 100 up to 500 for each of these. So data culture is all about behaviors and norms. So at level 100, it's very chaotic. At level 500, you've got a very strong data culture. Data is treated as an asset in your organization. People understand, their roles, responsibilities with it. It's quite a broad area, obviously, and it's quite a journey for data culture that you build up. Executive sponsorship is really important because as you're implementing processes and controls, you're going beyond the boundaries of the BI team generally, or you're going beyond the boundary of what BI traditionally does. So you really need that executive sponsorship to be able to drive the data culture with it, to make decisions and make things that have decisions that affect a broad audience within the organization. Content ownership, so this is where people are publishing, say, to their personal workspaces versus actually, group workspaces and people who own the content, not just random admins of workspaces who have no ownership of it. Content delivery scope, so this is really talking about the personal team enterprise BI distinction, which we're going to come on to. Center of excellence, when people hear the term center of excellence, when I heard it, I initially thought it was kind of a development team. But whilst you might do some development in there, it's actually really a team, or actually even a federated set of users across the business who are Power BI experts, whose role it is in the organization to empower and enable the use of Power BI and enable those developers and enable that to be better used. So that's really what we mean by COE. Governance is very much around processes and controls. So things we'll look at like tenant admin settings. At level 100, they're just ad hoc. They haven't been changed, they're all the default values. With level 500, it's much more purposefully thought about and set. And that's one of the things we're going to look at. Mentoring and user enablement, again, one of the key functions of the COE. So that's really very closely related to that. It's definitely about driving adoption. Building an internal community, like we have the external Power BI community, having that community in-house as well, so developers can help each other. User support is related. Where do people go for help? Technical support as well as content support. And then system oversight is around monitoring, looking at things like usage metrics and activity in the Power BI world. So what we'll do now, let's just have a look at now workspace scope and creation. So I'll cover some of the details in terms of workspaces. So I'm assuming most of you are familiar with workspaces as a concept. They're kind of the folders on the Power BI service where artifacts are stored. So data flows, data sets, and reports. And with workspaces, you can give people access to the workspace. So actually, if we you see here, this is a diagram where we've got different roles you can have in a workspace. You can assign someone as a viewer, as a contributor, a member, or an admin. And whilst this might seem like a very convenient way to give people access to content, it's actually not ideal because it's really meant for collaboration with developers, not for distribution of content. And actually, if you give someone rights on the workspace that's beyond a viewer role, so anything with edit rights, actually row-level security won't even apply to them. So even if you've set up rules for row-level security, if someone goes directly into a workspace and has edit access, then it's just they're going to see all the data in there. And sometimes people don't even realize things like that. So really, really useful to bear in mind that workspaces are those collaborative efforts. For distribution, you want to use apps. And apps, hopefully some of you are quite familiar with it, but the idea it's a package set of one or more reports within a workspace. And you can define your own custom branding, navigation. You could do things like include a link to a feedback form to collect feedback on the report, or videos or how-to guides as well as part of the overall report pages or the sense report. So it's a really good user experience from that perspective. So definitely apps are definitely part of that. Now, one of the things we wanted to look at is actually how do we see the workspaces and the content that we have across our organization. So one of the first things I think we want to do when looking at Power BI governance is this kind of current state assessment. What does our tenant look like today? As a Power BI admin, you can go into the admin portal and it shows you some really great visualizations on Power BI in terms of, have to be careful what I say here, Benny's on the cat team, but it shows you some really great visualizations around what works, what content you have on there. But there's very, very high level and you can't go into any detail, and it's not something that you could really get much of from today. So actually what we need to do today is go and collect that data ourselves. And there's 3 main tools that you could use today that I've seen to do this, and they're all free, they're all community tools. So the first one is PowerShell, and the best example I've seen of that is Rui Romano, who's also now on the Power BI Cat team. And if you just go to Rui Romano PBI Monitor or search for that online, you can just download the PowerShell scripts. They run as a service principal, so actually you don't need to be a Power BI tenant admin to run them. All you need to do is ask someone to set you up a service principal account in Azure and then enable that, put that into an AD group and put that into tenant settings, and then you can run the scripts on there. And that's what I've done at my clients. Even though I'm not a Power BI admin myself, I can run it as a service principal. There's also, and he actually also gives you a report. So it downloads the PowerShell script, goes through, collects activity and catalog data, and puts it into JSON files. And then he's provided a report to collect all those JSON files and analyze it. So it's done a lot of the work for you. Power Automate, if you're more familiar with Power Automate, then Tommy Paluga has also put out a solution that's based on Power Automate for this as well. And I think it uses some of the same JSON formats as that as well. And Azure Data Factory, Just, who's also here at this conference, has put a solution together for Azure Data Factory. So depending on what you use or what you're most familiar with, there's a few different ways to collect that data. I've only personally used PowerShell for Rui, but I managed to get that working without any real PowerShell knowledge. So that's pretty useful. The reason I actually haven't done a huge amount in this, well, as I was speaking to Benny about it earlier, is because there's a feature on the roadmap that's going to hopefully be launched sometime this year called Admin Insights. And the idea is that this will give you all of that admin data, the activity, the catalogs, as data flows and shared data sets in a workspace that will be available to Power BI admins, and they can also open that up to access to other people as well. I don't know whether it will completely replace the need for us to collect our own data, probably not initially in the longer term, but this looks like it'll be a really exciting feature because they're giving you not just the data, they're also giving you the reports and everything else as well. So hopefully this looks like it'll be a really good solution. And let's now look at just workspace management. So kind of application lifecycle management, if you like, for workspaces in particular. So in the tenant settings, which we'll look at, there's an option to say who can create workspaces. And by default, this is enabled for everyone. So everyone can go in and create a workspace. The challenge with that is that you can end up with a large number of workspaces with little control over it. So what we suggest is to kind of turn that off and have a process instead for people to create workspaces. So you can do things like a process flow. And you'll see this process flow diagram crop up a few times in very, very similar formats. So it's actually someone could go on to say a Power App form. They can go and request a workspace. And then it goes for approval, potentially, or potentially not. If it wants to be auto-created, you can set certain things to be auto-created. Once it goes for approval, then it creates the AD groups automatically and creates the workspace automatically through the API. So you can automate a lot of this process, but also the advantage of doing this is that you can also capture data about the workspace. You know, what kind of data, who's the owners, what do they expect to be in there, what's its purpose, and that metadata is really useful for then you to build that catalog. So it's a really good way to have both information. So sorry, I struggle a little bit of the pointers today. So we can see here actually log the response to the workspace request form, so somewhere like in a SharePoint list or something as well as part of that process. And also you could combine that with the data we were looking at before, like the activity data and the catalog data. So then you've got a much fuller picture of your estate going forward. Oh, sorry. So now let's look at tenant admin and security. So that was kind of workspace scope. Now we're going to have another whirlwind tour of secure tenant admins. So have you guys seen tenant admin settings before? Because you might not have done if you're not a Power BI admin. Yep, okay. So it's the settings that they're mainly security related. They're settings that allow you to go into, there's 84 settings, I think, last time I checked. It keeps growing. And it's, for most of these settings, they're things like who can publish to web, who can make the report accessible via a publicly accessible URL without authentication, who can export data, who can actually view and consume reports with custom visuals in them or develop them. So it's some of them could be really far-reaching. And actually, if you're doing this retrospectively, you need to be really careful here because things like this will override anything said at report level. So something like export to Excel, I was actually looking at my current client. They had like thousands and thousands of exports to Excel. And you're like, okay, well, we can't just turn this off because clearly there's people who've got processes based on this. You could take the approach of saying, right, we're going to put them all into an AD group to allow them to do it and then turn it off and set a process going forward. We're still having that conversation because it's not the easiest thing to try and do retrospectively. But there, some very granular details. So for almost all the settings, you can either apply it to everyone, disable it to everyone, or allow it for specific AD groups, Azure Active Directory groups. And we'll see Azure Active Directory groups come up again and again around how to manage things like security, access, everything. So really, really important. And there is then a list of full tenant settings there as well. In terms of how you decide what they should be, my key recommendation here is to document stuff. So go through and document what their settings are, what they are today, and also document security principles. So things that you want to make sure that you adhere to in the organization that is in line with your organization's security principles and risk appetite. Essentially, do you want people to be able to export data? Do you want, how worried are you about the use of custom visuals and things like that? And that will then determine. So these could be like headings in a spreadsheet. You've got things like the category, setting name, description. These you can just get from the Microsoft site or just copy and paste from there. Default current value will be the same if you haven't changed them. Recommended value in terms of the governance model. We'll come on to that in a minute. The governance model to be applied. And the rationale. And this is really important because if you get challenged on this later on, you've got this to go back to and say, actually, this is why we've set the setting like this, or this is what we need to do. So documenting it is really, really important. Also, actually, you can't go back and see what it was at any point in time. So you might as well document them now, and that way you've got your record. So in terms of the settings that you can apply, you could obviously apply enable for all. So enable for all, there's some things which are where you can't actually give more granular than that and you have to do it. But generally, enabled for all is not the best scenario because that includes everyone in your organization. In a large organization, this is contractors. This is anyone in your Azure Active Directory. So generally, you'd want to enable it for a specific group, even if it's a broad membership. Otherwise, you can enable it perhaps for people of a certain capability group. Maybe those developers that have completed Power BI training, something like that, you could put them into a group and enable certain functionality for them. So they have a certain amount of responsibility once they've completed the training and are tagged as Power BI developers. You can also do it on a use case basis. And actually, I think this is publish to web is probably a good example here, because regardless of role or capability level, you probably want to say, actually, you could publish to web if you've got a business justification for it, if you've got use case for it. So again, we'll see, you can have a very similar process flow where you can fill out a form and say, okay, here's my business justification, drop down, publish to web, here's what I'm going to do it. If it gets approved, you get automatically added to the AD group that allows you to publish to web. Or you could disable it and perhaps enable it, say, for Power BI admins as a backup. And yeah, that's what I was saying around process flow. Very, very similar process flow. You know, have a request process in there that's automated, and then it's logged. So you have a record of who's in that group and why and who approved it and all of that. Sensitivity labels, I'll cover this fairly quickly. Sensitivity labels are around defining, categorizing your data artifacts and reports and derivatives of them around how sensitive they are. So, you know, in UK it's like official sensitive as the public ones, or confidential, highly confidential. And you set these in Azure and they apply across the board in your Microsoft stack, so to Excel, PowerPoint. And actually for Power BI, they apply not just to the artifacts, but to derivatives. So if you export to Excel or export to PowerPoint, those files themselves contain the sensitivity labels. Now, what is associated with sensitivity labels when you set them in Azure Information Protection is controls. So you could say anything that's confidential, for example, someone needs to sign in when they open it in Excel. They can't just open a file that's been emailed to them. They have to authenticate. Or you could say you don't want it to be emailed to external email addresses. So in Outlook, it will block you from attaching a sensitive file. If it's tagged like that, you've set that control. So you could do things like that. So it's a really good thing to be able to do, but it's just Power BI is really a consumer of these labels, rather than kind of where you'd set them. So external sharing is another really interesting area, probably a talk in itself, but there's two main ways that you can share with people. So by default, you can share what's called ad hoc. So I could go in by default in a Power BI, I can share a report, and I could put in an external email address, any external email address. By default, I could even put in Hotmail, Gmail, anything. And what will happen is that email will be fired off to that person, and it will have a little invitation for them to that organization. And then once they accept, they'll be automatically added into the Azure AD and given access to that report. The other way to do it, and to do this, you'd have to block you can block the tenant settings. You can say, I don't want people to be able to do these ad hoc invites. And then the other way to do it would be planned invites. So someone would have to go into Azure AD, invite them from Azure AD, and then add them into an AD group, and then, or it has to be an AD group, but it should be an AD group, and then give them access to that report. Now that second way is much, much, much better. So much more transparent. You've got capability then to audit who externally has access to your reports. So it's a much, much better way to do it. Again, recommended to actually disable ad hoc invites with the tenant settings and have a central request process where someone says, I want to share this externally. You say fine, and then that's the process you go through. The guest user needs to have a license. So either you can give them that license or they can bring their own. But actually, generally, if we're talking about Power BI Premium per capacity, which is a lot of what we're talking about for Enterprise BI, you'd have that model anyway. So your external share, any content that's shared externally should be on Premium per capacity, should be Enterprise BI, and then by default, you don't need a license. You get around that. By default, it's only read-only, so they can't take on a workspace role, for example. You could change that in the tenant admin settings if you have specific consultants like Avanar to go in who need to manage your content for you. And actually how they access your tenants, if they just go to app.powerbi.com and I sign in with my Avanar account, by default that will just take me to the Avanar tenant. If I need to go to a client tenant, then I need to get the tenant URL. So you go to help settings and it's got the tenant URL in there. So then I could go to that URL, app.powerbi.com, and then /CTID equals, and then I'll go to that customer's tenant. So that's how people can access content there. And also row-level security, so that's how you can then restrict who sees what in a report. So this is, again, a really good, so you set the rules up in Power BI Desktop, you set a DAX logic to filter the data, and then you assign people to those roles in a Power BI service. And again, it's a really good way to use AD groups rather than assigning individuals. And the point here is you can actually reuse those AD groups. So the same AD groups that the report is distributed to, the app is distributed to, should be the same kind of groups you have in your row level security, and who also have read permissions in your data sets. And maybe your analyst community then has view permissions somewhere else, and you can reuse these groups across multiple purposes. So now we'll have a look at managed workspace architecture. So for a start, let's just go through what we mean by managed workspaces. So a workspace being managed is what we're talking about enterprise BI. So this is things that have reuse capability across your organization. So it'll be things like data that connects to your central enterprise data sources, SQL or whatever it is that you've got as your central data warehouses. It has wide usage across the organization. So you want people to connect to that single version of truth. The content in there will generally be certified, endorsed, to say this is the single version of truth for this data. Or it might potentially have sensitive data on there. And your enterprise BI workspaces, your managed workspaces, if you've got premium per capacity, this is where they belong. And that's your separation. Your separation is your stuff on enterprise BI, your managed workspaces are premium, and everything else is shared capacity. And that gives you that capability to manage those and monitor those a bit more closely as well. And you'll see actually a lot of the features that we use here will be premium features. So things like managing large data sets, deployment pipelines, all of these things for enterprise BI. We'll also have things like co-admins of the workspace from the Center of Excellence. Access to the content will all be managed through Azure AD groups. A higher level of support, SLA for the content. Application lifecycle management. Cataloging, so you can actually build a data catalog in Purview or something of those enterprise BI contents. Again, you need premium, where you can then say, actually not for Purview, you don't, I think, but then you can scan it and say, here's all the data. Someone could go in and search for, I want to see reports that have gross profit, and then get access to those. So you can build a whole catalog of your enterprise BI. And performance and usage will be more closely managed and monitored. So this is your managed workspaces. So just in terms of some of the areas that we've got, I'm not going to go through all of these just in the interest of time, but I'll go through them relatively quickly. So we've got gateways, potentially, if you've got any on-premise data sources, or actually even if it's behind a virtual network in Azure, which is quite common, and you can use a VNet gateway, although not for data flows yet. You have data flows, centrally created data flows. They contain the connections to those source systems and any base transformations, so shaping it into fact and dimensions, nothing else. You then have data sets, shared data sets. So these data sets are built off these data flows. In fact, I think for the enterprise BI content, those data sets shouldn't have any other data source other than the data flows that's coming from them. Everything should be coming through a single channel, not just random spreadsheets and things like that. And those data sets should be well built with well centrally agreed DAX logic and row level security. Even if you have a single row level security role that gives access to everyone who has access to the reports that are based on it, that's still better, because even then, if something gets shared ad hoc, outside, which you can't actually control, at least you've got that extra layer that people will go into it. If they don't have access to the row level security, they won't see any visuals. So things like that you put up on your enterprise BI and make sure you have it. Application lifecycle management, AAD group membership again, and monitoring and performance. So not going to go for a huge amount about gateways. It's very simple conceptually. It's just a piece of software on the machine that allows you to access it. The reason I like gateways from a secure governance perspective is because your credentials are held encrypted on the gateway server. So actually, if I want to create a data flow, and I've been added as a user to that data source on the gateway, I can go to data flows, say add this data source, and all the credentials be populated. Because the idea is you don't want to give everyone who's a Power BI developer access credentials to your data sources. It kind of defeats the point of having them secure. So gateways is one way to do that. Obviously, data flows, that team who has access to it can also create the data flows and then let people consume them. But different types of gateways, again, enterprise gateway is the way to go because it can connect to things outside of your machine. And you can disable personal gateway through PowerShell or group policy, things like that, GPO. and then access to gateways. Shared data sets, data flows. So data flows, actually, data flows, just so if people are aware, when it connects to data, it actually stores the outputs of that data in Data Lake, Azure Data Lake Gen 2. And you've got 3 different modes of data flows. The default is it will store it in Azure Data Lake, but it's managed behind the scenes by Microsoft. You don't see it. You can do the option of bring your own lake, which is where you actually specify a storage account to store the outputs of data flows into, and it will store snapshots of your data. Each time the data flow refreshes, it will store as CSV files that data. The reason you might want to do that is if you want to actually make that data available, say, to data scientists or other uses outside of Power BI. That's why you might decide to do that. And you've also got the option of external mounting, so bring your own lake. And actually what this will mean is that you can do your ETL rather than using Power Query Online for your data flows. You can do them, say, in Data Factory or something like that. And as an output of Data Factory, have it as a CDM, Common Data Model folder, and then just mount that into Power BI data flow. So it's read-only view of your data lake. So it's managed at enterprise scale, and you're just consuming it as Power BI as a consumer, complete read-only. It's another way, potentially a grow-up story for data flows. So again, this is why I really do like data flows. And I know there's challenges with them. It wasn't at the Power Hour, but I heard. Yep, shared data sets. The key thing with shared data sets is you need build permissions. So shared data sets is where you can then go into Power BI Desktop and say connect to an existing Power BI data set. You can now also bring your own data in, and you've always been able to add your own measures as well. But in order to be able to see that when you go to Power BI data sets, you need build permissions. And again, like with Power BI, there's multiple ways to do this. Number one, you can be, and if you have edit rights on the workspace, you automatically have build permissions to data sets in there. Number two, you can, the other way to do it is to assign build permissions directly on the data sets. And the third way is when someone shares a report with you, they can give you build permissions. Now, clearly, the best way to do it is to get permissions directly on a data set. You've also got things like data discoverability. Not going to cover that really today, but it's just where if people don't have access to data sets, you can make them discoverable so that they can still see them, search for them. An application lifecycle management standard is deployment pipelines, and you can automate some of that with DevOps. If you want to start doing source control and managing the data models as files or even reports as files, you need to start looking at external tools. So just very quickly, some free external tools you can use. ALM Toolkit, so this will allow you to compare your data models, so your measures, your table structures, with a hosted version on the Power BI service, for example, and then you can push changes. So you can make changes in desktop version and push it to just the metadata to the service. You've also got things like Action BI Toolkit, which allows you to actually really go in and look at the granular reports, every changes that have been made, and merge and diffs compares on the individual files. It's probably a bit too much. Or you've got something like Tabular Editor for the data model, where you can save it all the elements of your data model as JSON files and then push that through DevOps. So you've got a few approaches, and I know the Power BI team are also working on these. So just to kind of bring this all together, this is how your workspaces might look with data flows, shared data sets, and everything else. So if we look at, you might have, for example, say a workspace that just contains general data flows. So the people who would have access to this would be broad analysts across your organization as viewer rights. That's all they need to be able to access data flows. You then will have, if you look at your organization, you look at the data you have, and you can divide it up into subject areas. So this is a finance one where we're saying, okay, for the finance team, for the finance subject area, we have some core data sets. So we have some data flows that connect to the finance transaction systems, and we have shared data sets. And this workspace, the people who have access to it are the people in the finance team who need to build reports. They have build permissions on those data sets, and they also potentially have view rights on the data on the workspace itself, so they can access the data flows. Those analysts then do a live connection to those data sets and build thin reports for different audiences. So central finance, you might have a management reporting workspace, and then you've got your end consumers who access those via apps distributed via AAD groups. On the right-hand side, you have the kind of self-service architecture, where you can take those data flows, maybe take cuts of them, and other people can create their own data sets, their own data flows based off those. So last couple of sections now. So we'll look at roles, responsibilities. So first role we're going to look at is that of the Center of Excellence team. As I say, this could be a federated set of users, or it could be a team in itself. It's really going to consist of your Power BI experts. And the key role of this team is to be able to drive user empowerment, user enablement. So they can be the gatekeepers for your enterprise BI. They don't necessarily need to develop all the content in enterprise BI, but they can definitely help business teams to develop them, and monitoring and support, like a high level of support and things like that. Also around endorsement. So as I said, all your enterprise BI content should generally be endorsed and certified. And this is what the Center of Excellence team could do as well. So they could do things like set things as certified. So that in the tenant settings, the COE team will be the people who are allowed to certify. And they could do things like make sure it conforms to best practice. So even things like checking the tabular editor best practice analyzer rules and making sure it conforms to those. And then, you know, provided it's well built, that can then be a certified data set which sits in enterprise BI and is managed in the right way through application lifecycle management, AAD group for access. And this next section is really important because it's not just a Center of Excellence team. It's also about your developers and your users. And I think the key thing to think about with this is that the developer community is not homogeneous. Not everyone, even if they work with Power BI, is going to want to learn M and DAX to the nth degree to be able to do what they need to do. You're going to have probably a large swathe of analysts who are happy to just connect to existing data and use it. So actually, you want to enable them as well, right? So what we look at, and these are your kind of users across the organization as a pyramid structure. So at the bottom of the pyramid, which is the largest user base in an organization, are your blue belts. These are your end users of the your reports. They'll go in, they'll consume reports. That's all they do. Then you've got green belts. Now these people might also be consumers of reports, but maybe they'll do more exploratory analysis. Maybe they'll use Analyze in Excel, personalized visuals, drill through, drill downs, those kind of things. They might also produce their own reports, but probably not write M and DAX. They'll just connect to existing data sets, build their own visuals for a particular audience. You've got your red belts, which is a core developer community. These are the people who will build reports themselves and data models themselves, but largely for team and personal BI. So they'll connect to data sets, whether that's enterprise BI or other data sets, other data sources, build their reports, publish them into team and personal BI. And you'll have a large variability within this group. And then you've got your black belts, which are the Power BI experts, the people who will build your enterprise BI content. So each level of the pyramid supports the levels beneath it. Your black belts, I mean, ideally you'd have a black belt in every single team, business team. Now, the reality is they're very hard to come by. So you probably want to nurture some of those red belts into a specialist role, if you like, with Power BI, or, you know, you could try hire them, but it's not easy. It's very hard to find people at that skill level. So how you identify them, you can do things like training. So successful completion of, say, the PL300 course might be, you know, something that you could do for identified red belts, or licensing if they need to apply for a pro license, for example. And yeah, this is just looking at then how the kind of different types of training you'd have for people at different levels. What's really important to bear in mind here is that your end users do need training. We often forget about it. We just assume that people know how to use Power BI, but that's just not the case. We need to show people how to use reports, especially with all the features that you've got on there around consumption. So the Microsoft team do have some good Microsoft Docs on that as well. And yeah, developer training, PL300 is a really good core syllabus, and this is from data pairs, and you'll see that actually as people start to get more experience with Power BI, they tend to specialize in particular areas. So you want to help them on that journey. And end user training, we've talked about. And this is something we built at Altius and in Avanade, which was actually just a report that you can publish as part of apps to show people how to do things like drill through, drill down, tooltips, bookmarks, filter pane, all of those kind of things. So actually build it as an app, as then it comes into your navigation, publish it as part of the reports. Cool. And then we've got the last section, which is looking at monitoring and support. So here we need to think about the different types of support that we've got. So you've got content support. So this is where people need to understand, what does this measure do? How is this calculated? Is this data right? Things like that. Now, there's no point having those go to your help desk because they're not going to be able to help you with that. It's the developers or the developer teams who are going to be early people who are going to be able to answer that. So one of the things to highlight is to highlight who those developers are on the report itself, maybe on a cover sheet, or you set them, when you publish the report, you set them as the contact of the report, and then make sure people know how to find that contact. It's not the most obvious thing to do, but they can click the little drop down and it will see a contact on there. So that's really for content support. For content support, you can also do things like information panels. If you Google that guy in the cube, Adam Sachs has had a video on, you click a bookmark and it shows you little things in the report around what visuals mean and things like that. That kind of stuff is really good for content support too. You've got internal community support. As I say, internal community is really important. You could use things like Slack, Yammer, I should say Teams. Use things like Teams for your internal community support, and have that internal community and have the centre of excellence manage that. Make sure people are engaging. Make sure people are answering questions. You're not having people stuck there for days and days without that, because people will get stuck. Every day, I be working with Power BI every day for years, and I still get stuck every single day. So at Avanade, we're lucky we do have quite a strong internal community. I know a lot of organisations, a lot of customers we work with don't. So it's something you really need to build up. There is also the external community, and there's lots of MVPs and lots of Microsoft people on those who support it. You just might not be able to share as much as you can, right, on a public forum. And technical support, you want to really look at. You want to give your help desk a knowledge base with Power BI. They're not going to, most help desks are not just going to know how to deal with Power BI queries. So you need to give them that kind of FAQs knowledge base, how to route things. And then you have support and SLAs, and you have particular paths for particular types of issues that people have with Power BI. And perhaps the COE is the next level, and then perhaps Microsoft is your final level. So monitoring. So we've got usage metric supports. So by default, Workspace admins and members can see their own usage metrics. They are quite useful, but they're very isolated views. They're just kind of for your reports or reports in a workspace if you clear the filter on the report. But actually, again, hopefully in admin insights, we'll have more of that data across your entire tenant. Premium capacity. So this is where you've got premium capacity. Your capacity admins could go in and view an app that looks at memory, CPU usage, and things like that. And that's changed a fair bit with Premium Gen 2, where the focus is less on memory, more on kind of CPU utilization, concurrent usage, and things like that. Audit logs. We talked about that before. This is kind of activity that you can capture through the APIs, hopefully through Admin Insights soon. Bring your own log analytics. This is analysis services trace events for your premium data sets. You can actually set it up to write to Azure Monitor, like all data platform tools could do as well. And here then it will collect trace events, specific queries that are run, how long it took. Does it even do storage engine, formula engine, I think even, potentially. I think so. So you could really get into that level of detail, exactly what's been run against your cube. And even tie that back into where you're seeing peak usage on your premium capacity metrics, if the data works. Gateways, you've got monitoring that you can do on the gateway itself, and also they've started building some more out-of-the-box reporting. Most of what you'll see here is actually from admin.powerplatform.com, not from Power BI. You actually see them as from the Power Platform Admin Center instead. And Cloud App Security, here's where you can set up alerts for things like if people publish to web or change tenant settings and things like that. So you can get alerted if people do things, or also, people log into Power BI from unknown locations and things like that. You can even set up rules around who should be alerted of stuff. So there's lots of monitoring you can do there. And right, okay, so we covered a lot of stuff there. So let's just go do a quick recap of where we are, and then we'll take some questions. So we looked at these kind of main areas: Power BI adoption roadmap, overview of governance, workspace scope and creation. So how do you catalog your workspaces? How do you set the creation process? And then tenant admin and security. How do you decide what your tenant settings should be? How do you decide the governance models for those? And actually things like use case basis. How can you define things on a use case basis so people can be added to the right groups if they have a business justification for it? Manage workspace architecture, looking at enterprise BI, the stuff that's going to sit on your premium per capacity. Premium per user potentially for some of the features, but it's not, it's too broad. What that looks like: roles, responsibilities. So COE, the users in the belts, the blue belts, green belts, red belts and black belts. And then monitoring and support around some of those. Just a couple of points to really take away. You want to try and stage this. You don't want to try and just do everything in one shot. So for example, your tenant settings, decide on what they are and then give it a 3-month time lag and say, okay, we're going to implement this in 3 months. Manage those comms really carefully. The communications are really important to your developer community. If you start to alienate them, they'll just go back to Excel. So, be really careful how you do this. And also, it's not a pure technical activity. A lot of this stuff you can't actually control through technical controls. You can't actually stop people using personal workspaces, for example. You can't stop people sharing. So actually, a lot of that comes down to user education. This is how we want you to do it, and this is why. Give people the rationale. Think about how you measure success. One of the organizations I worked with fairly recently was all about measuring how many people reports get distributed to. And that's what I've called here as a vanity metric from the lead startup. It's not about how many people it goes to. Partly about how many people use it, but also how are they using it? Are they all just clicking on export to Excel and then just doing their own analysis in Excel? Not the right behaviors. So really look at what kind of metrics you want to track. And look at things like data democratization, giving people access to data, systems and tools. Data discovery. This is something I think the Power BI service should really, really be aimed at. Someone should be able to go into the Power BI service and search across measures, search across anything to find what they need and then request access if they don't have it. And then it does the same thing, adds them to AD groups. It's getting there. Data set discoverability is a good first step. And data literacy. As I said, not everyone's going to know how to use Power BI, and we want to get that across the organization. And that will drive the right user adoption. Cool. Any questions and feedback? Sorry, I know that was a lot of content there. Yep. Yep. No, you can't do it. No. It's the tenant just will whatever's on the tenant will just override anything that's on the report. Either way. To be honest, what you're suggesting is a really, really good idea, Benny. That actually you could set it for that level where actually you say you want the report to be able to go. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, no, it's override. Yeah, that way around. Any other questions? Yep. Yep. I think if you just search for it online, just Power BI adoption roadmap, it will come up. Sorry? No. It's just Google Power BI adoption roadmap or Bing, whatever you're searching. Cool. Yep. So. So you run the REST APIs in the background. Yeah. So if we go back to that, you've got the 3 ways to do it. So PowerShell scripts, and obviously you can run those through Azure as well automatically. So it could run PowerShell scripts and store the outputs in blob storage or something. You've got Power Automate, which can call the APIs and then store the data wherever you want to store it. Or you've got Azure Data Factory, which again does the same thing. It can connect to the APIs, connect to the data, and store the data where you need it. So those are the automated ways to collect the data. To be honest, what I do at the moment for my current client is just go in every week or so and just run a PowerShell script to do it. Cool, brilliant. All right, covers a lot of stuff. Okay, thanks a lot for attending, and yeah, any other questions, come and grab me.